I rented the cabin on a whim. I had been dealing with too much noise, too many people, too much everything. I needed to be alone for a while, somewhere quiet, somewhere far from the city. The listing promised exactly that. An old hunting cabin deep in the woods, no neighbors for miles. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, an outhouse, and whatever I brought with me. That sounded perfect. The drive out took longer than I expected. The dirt roads twisted endlessly through the forest, barely wide enough for my truck. I hadn't seen another vehicle for over an hour when I finally reached the turnoff. A rusted metal gate stood open, the hinges so corroded I doubted they'd moved in years. A wooden sign nailed to a tree beside it had once read something, but time had worn the letters away. I eased my truck through and followed the narrow track deeper into the trees. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by towering pines. It looked exactly as I'd hoped. Weathered, isolated, simple. Just a single room with a covered porch, a stone chimney, and a tiny woodshed out back. The grass around it was overgrown, and the firewood pile under the porch had rotted in places, but I didn't mind. This was what I wanted. Peace and quiet. I killed the engine and let the silence settle. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, no distractions. Just the wind shifting through the trees and the occasional bird call. I grabbed my bags and stepped inside. The inside was just as basic as I'd expected. A cot pushed against one wall, a rickety table, a single chair, and the wood stove. Shelves lined one side of the room, mostly empty except for a few rusted cans of food someone had left behind. A bundle of old newspapers sat in the corner, yellowed and brittle. The air smelled of dust, wood smoke, and something faintly sour that I couldn't quite place. I opened a window to let in some fresh air, then started unpacking. I spent the rest of the afternoon gathering firewood and making sure the place was livable. The outhouse was 100 feet behind the cabin, a leaning shack barely holding together. The door was warped, and inside, spiders had taken over every corner. I knocked down the worst of the webs and made sure nothing with too many legs was lurking in the pit below before deciding it would do. By dusk, I had a fire going in the stove and a simple meal heating in a pan. The temperature had dropped fast once the sun disappeared behind the trees, and I was glad I'd packed extra blankets. I ate in silence, listening to the fire pop and crackle. Outside, the forest had gone completely still. No wind, no night birds, nothing. Just silence. I didn't think much of it at first. I was used to noise, so maybe I just wasn't used to what real quiet sounded like. But as the night dragged on, something about it started to feel wrong. I sat there, staring at the flames, trying to put my finger on it. It wasn't just quiet. It was too quiet. The kind of quiet that made my ears ring. The kind that felt like it was waiting for something. I shook it off and got ready for bed. I left the fire burning low in the stove and crawled into the cot, pulling the blankets up tight. I was exhausted, and as weird as the silence was, I figured I'd get used to it by morning. I woke up in the middle of the night. Something had pulled me from sleep, but I didn't know what. I lay still, my breath slow and shallow, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint shadows on the walls. The room was cold, my breath fogged in the air. Outside, the silence stretched on, heavier than before. Then I heard it, a single, deliberate footstep just outside the cabin. Not an animal, not the creak of a tree shifting in the wind. A footstep, slow, careful, close. I held my breath, my heart pounding. Another step, then another. They circled the cabin, crunching through the undergrowth, stopping now and then before starting again. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal, but I knew better. Deer didn't walk like that. Nothing in the woods moved like that. I reached for the flashlight I had left by the bed and clicked it on, aiming it at the window. The glass was old and cloudy, and I couldn't see much beyond my own reflection. The footsteps had stopped. The silence had returned, thick and suffocating. I didn't move for a long time. I just sat there listening, waiting. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been nothing. My mind playing tricks on me, the stress of being alone in an unfamiliar place. I lay back down, pulling the blankets up tight, and forced myself to sleep. In the morning, I stepped outside and looked around. The ground was damp from the night's dew, and there, just beyond the porch, were footprints. Human footprints. Bare feet. No shoes. No socks. Just bare, muddy prints circling the cabin. Some of them led off into the trees, disappearing into the undergrowth. I stood there, staring, my stomach twisting. I wasn't alone out here. Someone had been watching me, walking around my cabin in the middle of the night, barefoot, in the cold. I packed up immediately. I shoved my gear into my truck, double-checking that nothing was left behind. As I climbed into the driver's seat, I took one last look at the cabin. The footprints were still there, dark smudges in the dirt, leading away into the woods. I started the engine and backed out onto the narrow road, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I didn't look back again. I arrived at the cabin just before dusk, the last light of the day filtering through the trees in long golden beams. The place was isolated, deep in the woods, about an hour's drive from the nearest town. I had rented it for the week, planning to disconnect from everything. No phone, no internet, just me and the quiet of the forest. The air was crisp with the coming autumn, and the scent of pine mixed with the faint smokiness of the previous occupant's fire still clung to the place. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, built decades ago, with thick wooden walls and a steeply pitched roof designed to shed heavy snow. The wraparound porch creaked beneath my boots as I stepped up to the door, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder. I unlocked the door, pushing it open to reveal the dimly lit interior, the scent of aged wood and dust greeting me. It was simple inside, just a main room with a fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and a bedroom in the back. The furniture was heavy and old-fashioned, worn but well-made. I set my bag down and lit the lanterns, knowing I had maybe another half hour of decent light before night settled in completely. I went to check the windows, making sure they were all closed. As I made my way through the small space, I noticed something a little off. The back door, the one that led out to the forest behind the cabin, was unlocked. I was sure the owner had locked up before I arrived, but maybe he had forgotten. Either way, I turned the deadbolt and made a mental note to keep an eye on it. I spent the next hour unpacking, setting my food supplies in the kitchen, and stacking firewood near the hearth. The silence out here was different from what I was used to. It wasn't like the quiet of an empty house. It was deep, absolute, as if the trees themselves swallowed up any sound. The only thing I could hear was the occasional rustle of leaves outside, the distant call of an owl. It should have been peaceful, but instead, it felt hollow, like something was missing. By the time night fell, I had a small fire going in the hearth. I sat in the armchair by the fire, sipping a cup of coffee and staring into the flames. The heat was comforting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't anything obvious, just a sensation, a kind of pressure in the air, like the weight of unseen eyes. I decided to shake it off. I was alone, in the middle of the woods. My mind was just playing tricks on me. I turned in early, locking the bedroom door behind me even though I knew it was unnecessary. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, the mattress thick and warm. I fell asleep quickly, but the night didn't pass as easily as I had hoped. At some point, deep into the night, I woke up. The fire had died down, leaving only faint embers casting a dim orange glow. The room was dark, the only light coming from the sliver of moon through the curtain. And then I heard it, a sound, a slow, deliberate creak of wood, the kind of sound an old floorboard makes under shifting weight. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed perfectly still, listening. Another creak, closer this time. My pulse hammered in my ears. Someone or something was inside the cabin. I kept my breathing as quiet as possible, my body frozen in place. My mind raced through the possibilities. Had I locked the front door? I was sure I had. The back door had been unlocked when I arrived. Had someone else been using this cabin before me? Someone who had come back, thinking it was still empty? I waited, listening for more movement. Minutes stretched on, but I heard nothing else. Just the wind outside, the faint crackling of dying embers. Finally, I worked up the nerve to move. Slowly, I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, clicking it on and sweeping the beam across the room. Empty. I exhaled, but my relief was short-lived. The bedroom door, the one I had locked, was open just a crack. A chill ran through me. I knew I had locked it. I forced myself to sit up, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. I listened again, but the cabin was silent. If someone had been inside, they were either gone or waiting. I wasn't about to go searching in the dark. Instead, I stayed awake, sitting with my back against the headboard, flashlight in one hand, a heavy wrench from my bag in the other. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. When morning came, the first thing I did was search the cabin. I checked every corner, every inch of the place. The front door was still locked. The windows were still latched. There was no sign of forced entry, but that didn't explain the open door. That didn't explain the sounds I had heard. I spent the day outside, keeping busy, trying not to let my imagination get the better of me. I chopped some wood, hiked a little way down the nearby trail, anything to distract myself. But as the sun started to dip again, the anxiety crept back in. I considered leaving, but I had paid for the week, and leaving meant driving an hour through the winding, empty forest roads at night. No, I told myself, I was being paranoid. It was just a creaky old cabin settling in the cold. That was all. That night, I locked the bedroom door again. I placed a chair in front of it, a makeshift alarm. I lay in bed, listening, waiting. Hours passed in silence, and I started to believe that maybe it had just been my imagination. Maybe I had left the door unlocked without realizing it. Then, in the dead of night, the sound came again. A slow, deliberate creak. And another, closer this time. My blood went cold. I sat up, gripping the flashlight. The chair in front of the door hadn't moved. That meant whoever was inside was already in the room. My breath came in shallow gasps. I scanned the darkness with the flashlight, my fingers tight around the wrench. Nothing. Just empty space, my duffel bag, the dresser, the old wooden wardrobe in the corner. The wardrobe. The door was open just an inch, just enough to see the deep black inside. My stomach twisted. I had checked it earlier. It had been shut. I forced myself to move, to get up, to step toward it. The floor creaked under my weight. I reached out, fingers trembling, and yanked the door open. Empty, but the smell hit me. Stale sweat, unwashed skin. My pulse pounded in my ears. Someone had been in there. Someone had stood inside that wardrobe, watching me. I checked every inch of the cabin again, every door, every window. Still locked, still secure, but I wasn't alone. I knew that now. I left at dawn, not bothering to pack, just grabbing my bag and getting into my car. As I drove away, I glanced back one last time at the cabin, at the dark windows staring back at me. Something had been there with me, and I had no intention of finding out what. I got the cabin for cheap, and that should have been my first warning. It was late October when I found the listing. A one-room hunting cabin, nestled in the deep woods of northern Montana, miles from the nearest paved road. It was an old structure, but sturdy, with stove, small porch, hand-pumped well about 20 yards out back. The owner's description said it was not for the faint of heart. I didn't mind. I needed solitude. A week away from people, noise, the constant stress of my life. I'd spent enough time outdoors to know how to take care of myself. The lack of electricity or running water didn't bother me. I was prepared for the isolation. I arrived just before dusk, my truck kicking up gravel as I pulled into the clearing. The cabin sat at the edge of a dense pine forest, the tree line pressing in close. It looked exactly as described. Weathered but solid, dark wood blending into the shadowy backdrop. The air was cold, crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles. The sky was already dimming, the sun bleeding out behind the trees. I unloaded my gear quickly. Rifle, cooler packed with food, a stack of firewood I'd brought in case the supply on site was low. The owner had said there was already a good pile behind the cabin, but I didn't want to take chances. It was colder than I expected, the temperature dropping fast. I could see my breath as I worked. Inside, the cabin was simple. A cot against one wall, a wood stove in the corner, a rough wooden table with a single chair. Shelves lined the walls, sparsely stocked with old tin cans and rusting utensils. A small oil lamp sat on the table. The only window was on the front wall, looking out over the clearing where I'd parked. The place smelled like old wood and dust, with a faint, lingering scent of smoke. I liked it immediately. I set up quickly, getting a fire started in the stove. The warmth spread slowly through the room, pushing back the chill. I ate a quick meal, then stepped out onto the porch to take in the silence. It was absolute. No wind, no distant highway noise, just the occasional rustling of trees. The darkness was thick, pressing in around the clearing. I couldn't see beyond the first few feet of woods. That first night was uneventful. I slept light, waking a few times to the crackling of the fire. The cot was stiff, but I didn't mind. The solitude felt good. The second day, I hiked. I planned to do some hunting, but mostly I just wanted to explore. The forest was dense, untouched, the kind of place where you could walk for miles and never see another person. The ground was covered in thick layers of pine needles, muffling my footsteps. I saw signs of deer, even found a few old tracks that could have been bear. The air was cold but fresh, the kind that filled your lungs and made you feel alive. By late afternoon, I was back at the cabin, feeling good. I spent some time chopping extra firewood, stacking it neatly behind the cabin. The pile was decent, but something about it seemed off. The logs at the bottom were older, damp, rotting in places. They hadn't been stacked properly, just dumped haphazardly. It wasn't what I expected. Someone who relied on this place should have known better than to leave wood like that. That night, something woke me. It was late. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The room was cold. I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep at first, but as I lay there, still and listening, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound. Footsteps, not close but not far, moving through the trees, slow and deliberate. Heavy enough that I knew it wasn't a deer, too slow to be a bear. I stayed still, barely breathing. The steps continued for a minute, maybe two, then stopped. The silence pressed in, thick and absolute. I strained to hear anything else. Breathing, movement, but there was nothing. Just the wind picking up slightly, rustling the tops of the trees. I told myself it was nothing. Could have been an elk, a moose. Could have been the trees settling, the cold shifting the earth. I forced myself to roll over, close my eyes. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. No tracks. The ground was firm, the pine needles undisturbed. If something had been walking out there, it hadn't left a trace. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. The unease from the night before lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. I split more wood, made sure my rifle was loaded, spent time reading an old paperback I'd brought along. The hours passed slowly. That night, I barely slept. The wind howled through the trees, and every creak of the cabin made my pulse jump. I kept the fire going, the glow casting just enough light to push back the darkness. I told myself I was being paranoid. Then, just past midnight, the sound came again. Footsteps, closer this time. My skin went cold. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding. The steps were slow, methodical. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. They moved around the clearing, circling. I gripped my rifle, muscles tense. Then they stopped, right outside the front door. The air was thick with silence. The fire crackled softly, but beyond that, nothing. No wind, no rustling trees. Just the sense of something, someone, standing just beyond the walls. Listening. I held my breath. Minutes passed. An eternity. Then, finally, slow, deliberate footsteps moved away, back into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I found tracks. Heavy boot prints in the dirt, circling the cabin. They led into the woods, vanishing into the undergrowth. My stomach twisted. There was no vehicle, no sign of another camp. Whoever had been out there had walked in from miles away. I packed up, threw my gear into the truck, doused the fire, locked the door behind me. I didn't look back as I drove away. A week later, I got a call from the property owner. He sounded hesitant, choosing his words carefully. You, see anything weird out there? I didn't answer. He let out a breath. Last guy left in a hurry, too. I hung up and never went back. I hadn't planned to stay in the cabin long. It was just supposed to be a quiet retreat, a place to get away from everything for a few days. A friend of a friend had a family cabin up in the mountains, an old one-room place with a wood stove, no running water, and only a weak solar panel set up for a little bit of light. It was remote, tucked at the end of a barely maintained dirt road, surrounded by dense forest. Exactly what I was looking for. The drive up took longer than I expected. The last few miles of the road were rough, more ruts than gravel, and I had to take it slow. I remember thinking it wouldn't be great if I got a flat tire out here. No cell service, no houses, nothing but trees and silence. But I made it. The cabin was smaller than I thought it would be, a squat structure of darkened logs, with a tin roof and a single window on the front. There was a shed nearby, its roof sagging slightly, and an outhouse a little farther into the trees. Everything about the place looked old but solid. Inside, it was basic. A wood stove in one corner, a single cot against the wall, some shelves with a few canned goods, and an old lantern. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust. There was a small table with a single chair, and the only light came from the late afternoon sun slanting through the window. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. I set my bag down and got to work. First, I unpacked the food and supplies I'd brought, setting them on the shelf. Then I went out to check the woodpile. There was enough to last a couple of nights, but I figured I'd gather more while I still had daylight. The forest was dense, the undergrowth thick. I stayed close to the cabin, gathering fallen branches and stacking them against the wall. By the time I finished, the sun was dipping low, the sky going that deep blue just before full dark. I went inside and lit the lantern. The glow was weak, barely pushing back the shadows in the corners. I made a quick meal, ate in silence, and sat for a while listening to the night sounds outside. The wind moving through the trees, the occasional rustle in the underbrush. Normal sounds, nothing out of place. I should have slept well. The day had been long, and I was exhausted, but I couldn't seem to get comfortable. The cot creaked every time I shifted, and the cabin's silence felt heavier in the dark. I kept listening, not for anything in particular, just listening. It was too quiet. Eventually, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, I was awake again, staring at the ceiling. Something had woken me. I lay there holding my breath, listening. At first, I thought it had been a dream, but then I heard it again. A sound from outside. Not an animal, not the wind. Something moving, slow, deliberate. I sat up, heart pounding. The lantern had burned out, leaving the cabin in deep darkness. I reached for my flashlight, flicked it on, and aimed it toward the door. Nothing, just the rough wood, the old latch. The sound had stopped. I sat there for what felt like forever, waiting, listening. Finally, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe a raccoon was nosing around. I lay back down but didn't close my eyes for a long time. The next morning was bright, almost too bright. The kind of morning where the light feels sharp. I went outside, walking the perimeter of the cabin, looking for any sign that something had been there. The ground was too hard for tracks, but I had the distinct feeling I wasn't alone. That feeling stayed with me all morning, gnawing at me. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was alone, in an unfamiliar place, my brain playing tricks on me. So I forced myself to go about my day. I gathered more wood, took a short hike along the barely there trail behind the cabin, and tried to enjoy the solitude. But as the day wore on, the feeling didn't go away. That night, I locked the door, wedging a chair under the handle. It was stupid, the door was solid and no one was out here. but it made me feel better. I let the lantern burn low, casting just enough light to see the walls. Then I lay down and waited for sleep. It didn't come. The sound came again, closer this time, slow footsteps moving around the cabin. I sat up, gripping my flashlight, barely breathing. The sound circled the cabin once, then stopped by the window. I didn't dare shine my light. I didn't want to see what was out there. Minutes passed. An hour. Silence stretched so long I started to doubt I'd heard anything at all. Maybe it had been the wind. Maybe the latch on the door rattled. I stopped breathing. My whole body went stiff. I stared at the door, my mind racing. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. Someone was out there. The latch moved again. Slow. Testing. The chair against the door shifted slightly. Just a little, but enough. Then, nothing. I sat there for what felt like hours, every muscle tight. The silence pressed in. Eventually, exhaustion won. My eyes burned. My body ached. I must have fallen asleep sitting up because the next thing I knew, daylight was filtering through the window. I checked the door first. The latch was still in place, the chair still wedged under the handle. But something felt off. I stepped outside, scanning the clearing. Nothing looked different, but the air felt wrong. Heavy, like the woods were watching me. I didn't stay. I packed up, loaded my gear, and got in the car. The drive back down the road felt longer than it should have, like the trees were pressing in closer. When I finally hit pavement, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I never found out who or what was out there. I don't want to know, but I'll never go back to that cabin. Some places aren't meant to be visited. The road leading up to the cabin was nothing more than a rutted, uneven dirt track cut through thick pines and underbrush. It had rained earlier that day, and the potholes were filled with muddy water, making the drive slow and frustrating. My tires slipped a few times, skidding in the wet earth, but I eventually pulled up to the clearing where the cabin stood, isolated in a patch of tall grass and fallen leaves. It was old, built of dark, weathered wood with a steep pitched roof and a single chimney rising from the back. The place belonged to a friend of a friend, someone I'd never met but who had apparently bought the property for hunting. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs and rolling my shoulders. It was silent out here, so silent it felt unnatural. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. The sun was starting to dip below the ridgeline, casting long shadows across the clearing. I grabbed my duffel bag and walked up to the cabin's front porch, where a rusty key had been left under a loose board by the door, just as I'd been told. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and old wood. It was simple, a single large room with a cot against the far wall, a table, a few chairs, and a wood-burning stove. A hunting rifle leaned in the corner, and a stack of firewood was neatly piled by the door. The windows were small, making the inside dim even before the sun fully set. I flicked the light switch by the door, but nothing happened. The power wasn't working. I sighed and set my bag down, checking my phone. No service. That didn't surprise me. I'd known this place was off the grid, but I hadn't expected it to feel quite so cut off. Still, I wasn't here to scroll through my phone. I was here for a few days of quiet, a break from everything, and some time to clear my head. I set about making the cabin livable for the night. There was a cooler in my car with some food, and I placed what I needed on the table. I lit a few candles I'd brought and set them around the room, their flickering glow casting shadows across the walls. I checked the rifle loaded. The shells were kept in a small box nearby. I wasn't a hunter, but I knew how to use a gun if I had to. Outside, the woods darkened quickly. I built a fire in the old stone pit a few yards from the cabin and sat by it, listening. The silence wasn't complete anymore. Twigs snapped in the undergrowth. The occasional hoot of an owl echoed from the trees. A light wind stirred the branches overhead. I ate my dinner by the fire, then let the flames die down before heading back inside. As I was closing the door, I had the uneasy feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned, scanning the tree line. Nothing, just the same darkness and stillness. But the feeling lingered. Inside, I locked the door, bolting it with the old latch. I set the rifle within reach and climbed onto the cot, pulling my sleeping bag up around me. The wind picked up outside, rattling the trees. I lay there for a long time, listening, waiting, but nothing happened. Eventually, I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. Sometime in the night, I woke abruptly. A sound had pulled me from my sleep, but I wasn't sure what it was. I lay still, heart pounding. The fire had died completely, leaving the room in deep shadow. I listened. Then I heard it again, faint but distinct. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. They were outside the cabin. I held my breath, gripping the sleeping bag tightly. My mind raced. An animal? A bear? No, the steps were too precise, too careful. Human. I sat up slowly, reaching for the rifle. The sound stopped. I strained to hear, but the silence pressed in again. Maybe it had been a dream. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Minutes passed. Then another sound. A soft scrape, like someone shifting their weight on the porch. I tightened my grip on the rifle. The door was locked, but the windows weren't reinforced. If someone wanted in badly enough, they could break the glass. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. Then, a whisper of movement. Not at the door, at the window. I turned my head slowly, staring at the nearest window, but I couldn't see anything. The candle had burned down to a stub, barely giving off any light. My mind ran through possibilities. A lost hiker? Someone from a nearby property? But there weren't any nearby properties. I checked the maps before coming here. I stayed completely still, my muscles rigid. Then, in the darkness, another noise. A slow, deliberate tapping on the glass. 3 soft taps, then silence. I raised the rifle, aiming at the window even though I couldn't see anything. My breath was coming fast now, my hands sweating. And then footsteps, moving away, slow and steady back into the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night, rifle in hand, my ears straining for any sound. But nothing else happened. No more footsteps, no more tapping. Just the wind in the trees and the distant calls of night birds. When the sky lightened, I finally moved. My body ached from staying tense for so long. I stood, stretched, and walked to the window. There were footprints in the mud outside. Human footprints. They led from the tree line to the porch and then back again, disappearing into the woods. I packed my things quickly, shoving everything into my bag and heading for my car. I didn't care how bad the road was. I was leaving. As I stepped onto the porch, I glanced back one last time at the cabin. Something was nailed to the door. A single strip of bark, stripped clean, a knife wound driven through it to hold it in place. A message? A warning? I didn't wait to find out. I climbed into my car, turned the key, and drove, not looking back. I never found out who had been out there that night. I never told my friend what had happened. I just knew I wouldn't be going back. I pulled off the winding mountain road just as the sun dipped below the ridgeline, casting long shadows across the forest. My truck's headlights illuminated a narrow dirt path leading to the cabin, an old structure nestled deep in the woods. The place had been in my family for years, though no one had used it in a long time. My uncle had built it decades ago, back when he still thought he'd retire out here. That never happened, and the place had mostly been left to the elements. I figured I'd spend a few days up here, get away from everything, enjoy the quiet, maybe do some hunting and fishing. The tires crunched over loose gravel as I pulled up to the front porch. The cabin was a small, sturdy thing, one story with a loft made of weathered logs that had darkened over time. The front door had a padlock on it, just as I'd expected. I climbed out of the truck and grabbed the key from my pocket. It took a little effort, but the lock finally popped open, and I pushed the heavy wooden door inward. The inside smelled of old wood and dust, mixed with the faint scent of animals, probably mice. I flicked on my flashlight, sweeping it around the interior. The furniture was still there. A worn-out couch, a wooden table, a cast-iron stove in the corner. A set of deer antlers hung above the fireplace, the skull bleached white with age. Everything looked just as I remembered from childhood trips up here with my uncle. I set down my bag and started unpacking. I had enough supplies for a few days. Canned food, a couple gallons of water, a small propane stove in case the old wood-burning one didn't work. My rifle was strapped to my pack, along with a box of ammunition. The plan was simple. Spend some time alone, enjoy the solitude, maybe get a deer if I was lucky. The first night was uneventful. I made a small fire outside, cooked a can of chili, and listened to the sounds of the forest. The wind moved through the trees, creating a constant rustling noise. Every so often, I'd hear something scurrying in the underbrush, probably raccoons or squirrels. Nothing unusual. By the time I turned in for the night, I felt relaxed, more at ease than I had in weeks. I woke up sometime past midnight, heart pounding, ears straining. The fire outside had died down to glowing embers, casting a dim orange light through the window. I didn't know what had woken me, but something felt off. The woods were too quiet. I listened for a long time, waiting for the normal sounds to return, but they didn't. No wind, no night animals, just silence. After a while, I convinced myself it was nothing and went back to sleep. The next morning, I walked around the property, checking for anything unusual. I found nothing out of the ordinary, just old leaves, fallen branches, the usual forest debris. I spent the day exploring, hiking through the dense trees, following an old game trail I remembered from when I was younger. I set up in a good spot and waited, rifle resting on my lap, scanning the woods for movement. By late afternoon, I hadn't seen anything. No deer, no small game, not even birds. The woods felt strangely empty, like something had disturbed the natural order. I headed back to the cabin, my unease growing with each step. That night, the feeling of being watched returned. I sat by the fire, staring into the darkness, trying to shake the sensation. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I wasn't used to being alone out here. But deep down, I knew better. Then I heard it. A branch snapped somewhere in the trees, loud and deliberate. Not the random crack of a falling limb, but the sharp sound of something stepping on it. I turned my flashlight toward the woods, but the beam barely cut through the darkness. I couldn't see anything beyond the first few trees. For a long time, I sat there listening, waiting, but the sound didn't come again. Eventually, I forced myself to go inside. I locked the door, slid the bolt into place, and double-checked the windows. I tried to tell myself it was just a deer or a bear passing through, but I didn't believe it. I barely slept that night. Every little noise set me on edge. A gust of wind against the roof, the creak of old wood settling, the faint rustle of leaves outside. Each time, I held my breath, waiting for something more. By morning, I was exhausted. I debated packing up and leaving, but I felt stupid running from nothing. Instead, I grabbed my rifle and decided to take another walk, see if I could find tracks or any sign of what had been near the cabin. What I found made my stomach drop. About 50 yards from the cabin, in a patch of soft dirt, was a footprint. A human footprint, but it wasn't fresh. The edges had crumbled slightly, the way they do after sitting for a while. Someone had been here watching, maybe days before I arrived. I scanned the area, heart hammering. I found more tracks leading deeper into the woods, but they disappeared in the underbrush. I didn't hunt that day. I spent it reinforcing the cabin instead. I nailed wooden planks over the windows, made sure the locks were secure, kept my rifle within arm's reach at all times. I built up the fire early, letting the smoke rise into the sky, hoping it would deter anyone from coming too close. That night, I stayed inside, listening. Around midnight, the noises started again. This time, it wasn't just one branch snapping. It was multiple coming from different directions. Slow, deliberate steps moving through the brush, circling the cabin. I gripped my rifle tight, heart pounding so hard I thought it might shake the walls. Then came the sound of something brushing against the cabin wall. A light, dragging noise, like fingertips running along the wood. I raised my rifle, aiming toward the door, my finger resting on the trigger. I wanted to call out to scare off whoever or whatever was out there, but I stayed silent. The noise stopped. Minutes passed. An hour. Nothing. At some point, exhaustion won out, and I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the cracks in the window boards. I stepped outside, rifle in hand, scanning the tree line. I didn't see anything, but I felt it. Something had been there, watching, waiting. That was it for me. I packed up and left. I didn't bother cleaning up, didn't even put out the fire properly. I just threw my gear in the truck and drove. A week later, I told my uncle about it. He listened quietly, then nodded. "That's why I never retired out there," he said. "I never went back to the cabin. I don't know who or what was out there that night. Maybe just some backwoods drifter. Maybe something worse. Either way, I wasn't about to find out." I never liked being alone in unfamiliar places, but I had convinced myself that this trip to the cabin would be different. A week of solitude in the mountains sounded like a reset I desperately needed. I had been working too much, barely sleeping, and burning myself out. A friend of mine had offered up their family's hunting cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. No cell service, no internet, just me, nature, and my thoughts. It was supposed to be peaceful. It wasn't. The drive to the cabin was long. The further I went, the fewer signs of life I saw. The last stretch was a rough dirt road, barely wide enough for my truck, with steep drop-offs on one side and thick forest on the other. When I finally arrived, the place looked just like the pictures my friend had shown me. A small, weathered structure with a slanted tin roof and a wraparound porch surrounded by towering pines. It had been in their family for years, mainly used for hunting trips and occasional getaways. There was a small shed out back, a fire pit, and an outhouse a short walk into the woods. No electricity, just a propane lantern and a wood stove for heat. The first thing I noticed when I stepped out of the truck was the silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, just dead, heavy stillness. I brushed it off as my mind adjusting to the quiet after so many years of city noise. I unloaded my gear, brought everything inside, and set up for the week. The cabin smelled of old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic. I lit a lantern, placed it on the wooden table, and sat down to eat a quick meal before nightfall. That first night, I struggled to sleep. Every little sound outside put me on edge. The creaking of the trees in the wind, the occasional snap of a twig. It all made me hyper-aware of just how alone I was. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I finally drifted off. The next morning, I went outside to gather firewood. That's when I saw them, footprints. They weren't mine. They were spaced too far apart, deep in the mud like someone heavy had walked through after the rain the night before. They led from the tree line to the cabin, circled around it, and then disappeared back into the woods. I stood there for a long time, heart pounding. Could have been a hunter passing through, but something about it felt wrong. Why circle the cabin? Why leave without knocking? I told myself I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the unease. I kept an eye on the woods the rest of the day, looking for any movement. Nothing, just trees swaying in the wind. That night, I barely slept. Around 2 a.m., I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps outside. Heavy. I held my breath, listening as they stopped near the front porch. The boards creaked. Someone was out there. I stayed still, every muscle tense, waiting. Minutes passed. Then the footsteps moved again, this time around the side of the cabin, toward the back door. I sat up slowly, heart hammering, straining to hear over my own breathing. Then silence. I waited for what felt like an hour before moving. I reached for the rifle I had brought with me, just in case. I wasn't a great shot, but the weight of it in my hands made me feel slightly less vulnerable. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the rifle, listening. When morning finally came, I stepped outside. The footprints were there again, fresh in the damp earth. Whoever it was had stood on the porch for a long time. I followed the tracks around the cabin. They stopped at the back door, then led back into the woods. I considered leaving. Something was telling me to go, but I convinced myself I was being paranoid. I had my rifle. I had locked the doors. If someone was messing with me, they were probably just trying to scare me off. The next night, I barricaded the doors. I stacked chairs against them, wedged pieces of wood under the handles. I was determined to stay awake, but at some point, exhaustion won. I woke to the sound of breathing, not mine. It was right outside the cabin wall, slow and heavy. I stayed as still as I could, barely daring to breathe myself. The breathing moved along the wall, toward the window. The lantern was still burning, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. I forced myself to sit up and look. Nothing, but I felt it. Someone was there, watching. I grabbed the rifle and stood, my legs shaking. I moved to the window, peered out into the darkness. The trees stood motionless, the clearing empty. But I knew better. I stayed like that until the first light of dawn. Then I packed my bags. As I loaded up my truck, I did one last check around the cabin. That's when I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Above the back door, carved into the wood, were the words, "Still here." I never drove so fast in my life. I didn't stop until I hit the nearest town miles away. I told my friend what happened. He didn't believe me at first, but when we drove back together a few days later, the words were still there. The footprints had been washed away by the rain, but that message, scratched deep into the wood, remained. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never go back. I rented the cabin because it was cheap. The listing had a few blurry photos, mostly of the trees around it. The description was vague, secluded, rustic, peaceful. I was looking for somewhere quiet to finish a project, a few days away from the city. The idea of silence and fresh air sounded good at the time. The owner responded fast when I messaged him. Just sent the address, no instructions. When I asked about a key, he said the door would be unlocked. That should have been my first red flag. I brushed it off. I told myself maybe it was just that kind of place, the kind where people don't lock doors. The drive out was long. The roads went from pavement to gravel, then from gravel to dirt. My tires skidded in places, the road narrowing as I climbed deeper into the mountains. By the time I found the cabin, I hadn't seen another house in miles. The trees pressed in from all sides, thick and tangled, swallowing most of the daylight. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected. A single room with a loft, the wood dark with age. The front door was slightly ajar, rocking in the breeze. I hesitated before stepping inside. The air was stale, like it hadn't been opened in months. There wasn't much to it. A small wood stove, an old mattress in the loft, a table with 2 chairs. A few cabinets above a sink, their doors hanging crooked on their hinges. A single dusty window on the far wall. There was no electricity, just an old oil lamp and a stack of firewood beside the stove. No running water either. I had to haul it in from a pump outside. I dropped my bag on the floor, went back out to get the rest of my stuff. The quiet was heavy. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own footsteps on the dirt. As I carried my things inside, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe the way the air felt stale, but the fireplace had ashes, as if someone had used it recently. Maybe the way the door was open, even though the owner told me it was supposed to be unlocked. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I latched the door behind me, set my things down, and tried to settle in. The first night was uneasy. The silence pressed against my ears. Every little sound felt too loud. The creak of the floorboards, the rustle of my sleeping bag. I tried to write, but my thoughts felt sluggish, heavy. At some point, I dozed off at the table. When I woke up, the oil lamp had burned low. The air felt colder. I went to the loft, climbed into the old mattress, and forced myself to sleep. Something woke me a few hours later. A sound outside, soft, deliberate, footsteps on dirt. I held my breath, listening. The sound came again, slow, careful steps moving around the cabin. I stayed still, my heart hammering. Could have been an animal, a deer maybe, but the steps were too steady, not the erratic movement of something four-legged. I waited, barely breathing. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then stopped near the front door. A long pause, then a soft creak, like weight shifting on the wooden porch. The latch on the door rattled. Just once. I stayed frozen. The door was locked. Whoever was out there couldn't get in. Another long pause. Then, footsteps moving away. Slow, unhurried. I didn't move until the first light of dawn. When I finally worked up the nerve to check outside, nothing was there. No tracks. No sign anyone had been there at all. I told myself I imagined it. Maybe I was still half dreaming when I heard it. Maybe the wind rattled the latch. I forced myself to believe that, even though the air had been perfectly still, the second night was worse. I kept the lamp on as long as I could. The dim light cast long shadows, flickering across the walls. I tried to drown out my own paranoia, focusing on my work, but the quiet pressed in. Then, around midnight, the footsteps came again. This time, I knew I wasn't imagining it. Slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. The same as before. Pause on the porch. Then something new. A sound at the window. A slow drag of fingertips against the glass. I didn't move, didn't even blink. Just stared at the window, at the blackness beyond it. The sound stopped. Another long silence. Then, footsteps moving away. The next morning, I packed my things. I didn't care how much time I had left in the rental. I wasn't staying another night. I went outside to load up my car. That's when I noticed it. The footprints. Bare. Human. Too large to be mine. They circled the cabin, pausing at the window at the door. I didn't stop to think. I threw my stuff into the back seat and got into the car, locking the doors. The engine roared to life, and I tore out of there, dirt and gravel flying behind me. I didn't stop driving until I hit the highway, until the mountains were far behind me. I never called the owner, never asked who else had been staying out there. I didn't want to know. I just know I wasn't alone, and whoever was out there had been waiting, watching, maybe for days, maybe longer. I had been driving for hours, weaving through empty mountain roads that twisted along the edges of dense pine forests. The sun had dipped below the horizon an hour ago, leaving only the faint glow of twilight filtering through the trees. My destination was an old hunting cabin my uncle used to own, a place I had visited a few times as a kid, but hadn't seen in over a decade. It had been years since anyone had stayed there, but I needed a quiet retreat for the weekend, somewhere far from the city and all the noise that came with it. When I finally reached the turnoff, my headlights illuminated the overgrown driveway. The dirt path leading to the cabin was rough and uneven, lined with thick underbrush that had encroached over the years. I eased my truck forward, branches scraping along the sides as I navigated the narrow path. It was slow going, the darkness pressing in from all directions. My only company, the distant sounds of the forest. The cabin sat in a small clearing, barely visible until my headlights swept across it. The wooden structure looked smaller than I remembered, the weathered exterior showing signs of years of neglect. The porch sagged slightly, the front steps warped from exposure. The sight of it sent a wave of unease through me, though I told myself it was just the eeriness of arriving alone in the dark. I cut the engine, and silence settled over me like a heavy blanket. No distant traffic, no hum of electricity, just the wind moving through the trees. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and stepped out, my boots crunching on the gravel. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The key was exactly where I remembered, under the third loose plank on the porch. I fumbled with it in the dim light of my truck's headlights before finally fitting it into the rusted lock. The door groaned in protest as I pushed it open, revealing a dark interior that smelled of old wood and dust. I flicked the light switch out of habit, even though I knew there was no electricity. Nothing. I reached into my bag for my flashlight, clicking it on and sweeping the beam across the room. The inside was almost exactly as I remembered: simple wooden furniture, a stone fireplace, and a kitchen with an old propane stove. There were a few cobwebs in the corners, but otherwise it was in decent shape. I set my bag down near the fireplace and turned my attention to getting a fire going. The nights got cold up here, and without central heating, the fireplace would be my only source of warmth. I found a stack of firewood near the hearth, dry enough to use. After a few minutes of effort, flames crackled to life, casting flickering shadows across the cabin walls. With the fire going, I felt a little more settled. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the old couch, figuring it would be warmer than the dusty cot in the bedroom. I ate a quick meal of jerky and granola bars, washing it down with a bottle of water before settling in. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the branches against the cabin walls. The sound was familiar, almost comforting. What wasn't comforting was the faint creaking sound I kept hearing, like footsteps shifting on the porch. I told myself it was just my nerves, that the wind could make anything sound like something it wasn't. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I heard it again. A slow, deliberate creak. I sat up, gripping my flashlight. The firelight didn't reach the windows, leaving them black as tar. I listened, holding my breath. The wind howled, masking any quieter sounds, but I swore I heard something moving just outside. For a long time, I didn't move. I just listened, my heart pounding in my ears. I wasn't sure how much time passed before I finally convinced myself that if something was out there, I needed to see it. I climbed off the couch as quietly as possible, my flashlight held tight in one hand. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I moved toward the front window. Slowly, I peeled back the curtain, shining my light outside. Nothing. The truck sat where I had left it, its surface already coated in a fine layer of dust. The porch was empty. No movement in the trees, no signs of anything unusual. I let the curtain drop and exhaled slowly, feeling foolish for letting my imagination get the better of me. It had been a long drive and I was exhausted. I locked the front door, something I hadn't initially bothered to do, before returning to the couch. The fire had burned down slightly, casting softer shadows now. I told myself I was safe. I had to be. Sometime in the night, I woke up. The fire was almost out, just glowing embers now. The room was much darker, but something had pulled me from sleep. I stayed still, listening. A noise, faint but there. It wasn't the wind this time. It was closer, inside the cabin. A soft scuff against the wooden floor. My blood ran cold. I gripped my flashlight but didn't turn it on, afraid of what I might see. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the sound. Came again. A shifting, shuffling sound, slow and deliberate. Something was inside with me. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe quietly. The knife I had brought for camp chores was in my bag, a few feet away. If I could reach it. The sound moved closer now. A slow step, then another. I couldn't take it anymore. I flicked on my flashlight and swung the beam toward the noise. For a split second, I saw something, a shape, a figure. But the light hit it and it bolted. The front door slammed open so hard it nearly came off the hinges. I scrambled to my feet, heart hammering. My truck keys, I needed my keys. I snatched them from the table and lunged for the door, nearly tripping over myself as I ran outside. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I reached the truck and yanked the door open, hands shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw it into reverse, my headlights sweeping across the trees. For a brief moment, I saw something in the tree line. A man, tall, ragged, clothes hanging off his thin frame. His face was obscured by shadow, but I could see his eyes reflecting the light, locked onto me. I didn't wait to see what he would do. I slammed the truck into drive and tore out of there, gravel spitting from my tires. My hands were white-knuckled on the wheel as I sped down the winding road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station nearly an hour away. Inside, under the harsh fluorescent lights, I tried to steady my breathing. My mind raced, replaying what had happened. Had he been living in that cabin, watching it, waiting for someone to show up? I didn't know, and I never went back to find out. A week later, I told the sheriff about what happened. He sent a deputy up to check the cabin, but they didn't find anything. Just an old place, empty and abandoned. But I knew better. Someone had been there, and they had been waiting. The road leading up to the cabin was barely a road at all. It was a single lane of packed dirt, rutted from years of seasonal runoff, winding up into the mountains without a single sign of maintenance. I hadn't seen another car for over an hour, and when I finally reached the turnoff, the GPS signal had long since disappeared. The only marker for the cabin was an old wooden post with a hand-carved number nailed into it, barely visible through the overgrowth. The sun was dipping behind the tree-line, casting long shadows that made everything feel more isolated than it already was. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. The cabin stood about 50 yards ahead, partially obscured by tall pines. It wasn't much, just a small single-story structure with a slanted roof, a covered porch, and a chimney that looked like it hadn't been used in years. It had been advertised as a secluded retreat for the adventurous soul. At the time, that had sounded like exactly what I needed. A few days alone, away from everything, no work emails, no phone calls, no obligations. Just me, the quiet, and whatever I could do to keep myself busy. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles as I stepped out of the car. It was crisp but not cold, the kind of mountain air that feels fresh no matter how long you breathe it in. I grabbed my bag and headed up the porch steps, the old wood creaking under my weight. The door was unlocked, just as the rental company had promised. Inside, the cabin was simple: one main room with a kitchenette, a small table, and a single armchair by the fireplace. A narrow hallway led to the bedroom and a tiny bathroom. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just a few shelves of old books and a single oil lamp in case the power went out. It was perfect. I spent the first few hours settling in, unpacked my bag, made a small dinner, and sat on the porch with a beer, watching the last of the daylight disappear behind the ridgeline. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant call of some unseen bird. It was the kind of quiet that wasn't just peaceful but absolute. The kind that made you hyper-aware of every sound your own body made. Your breathing, the rustling of your clothes, the way your footsteps seemed unnaturally loud against the wooden floorboards. That night, I woke up to something moving outside. It wasn't much, just a soft crunch of leaves, barely audible over the wind. At first, I told myself it was nothing, probably just a deer or some other animal passing through. But as I lay there in the dark, the sound didn't go away. It moved, slow and deliberate, like someone walking barefoot through the underbrush. I held my breath and listened. The noise came from the left side of the cabin, near the porch. It was too heavy for a raccoon, too slow for a deer. Something was out there. I didn't have a gun, but I did have a heavy-duty flashlight. I grabbed it from my bag and switched it on, flooding the room with harsh white light. The sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise itself. I waited, my heart hammering in my chest. After a few minutes, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it had been the wind shifting the trees or an animal that had already moved on. I turned off the flashlight and lay back down. It took a long time to fall asleep. The next morning, I went outside to check. There were footprints in the dirt. Not boot prints, not shoes, bare feet. They led from the edge of the tree line to the porch, stopping just short of the steps. Then they turned and went back the way they had come. The sight of them sent a shiver down my spine. They were fresh, made sometime during the night while I was asleep inside. I told myself it had to be some local messing with me. Maybe a hiker who had wandered too far and got lost. But why come so close to the cabin? Why just stand there? I spent the rest of the day on edge. Every creak of the trees, every shift of the wind put me on alert. I kept the flashlight close, double-checked the locks, and tried to focus on anything else. I read. I walked down to the creek. I did everything I could to convince myself I wasn't being watched. That night, it happened again. The same slow footsteps, moving through the trees. This time, they came closer. I didn't move. I just lay there in the dark, listening. The footsteps stopped at the porch. A long silence followed. Then, the unmistakable sound of the porch boards creaking under weight. Someone was standing right outside the door. I gripped the flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. If I turned it on and saw someone standing there, what would I even do? I didn't have a weapon. I didn't have cell service. I was completely alone. The porch creaked again, and then, slowly, the footsteps moved away, back into the trees. I stayed awake until dawn. As soon as there was enough light to see, I went outside. The footprints were there again, clear in the dirt. They had stopped right at the door. I wasn't staying another night. I packed up my things in record time, threw everything into the car, and peeled out of there so fast I nearly skidded off the road. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I hit pavement, where I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. When I got back home, I called the rental company. I didn't mention the footprints. I just told them I had to leave early, and I asked if anyone else had ever reported strange activity up there. The woman on the phone hesitated before answering. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. No one's rented that cabin in years. I hung up without saying another word. I needed a break from everything: work, city noise, people. A friend had mentioned a cabin way out in the woods, about a 4-hour drive from where I lived. It belonged to an old family member of his who had passed, and no one really used it anymore. He told me it wasn't anything fancy, just 4 walls, a roof, and enough space to stretch out for a weekend. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed light, took my dog, filled up my truck, and drove out early in the morning, aiming to reach the cabin by midday. The road got worse the deeper I went into the forest. Pavement turned to gravel, then to a narrow dirt path with deep ruts that made my tires struggle. I kept checking my GPS, but service had dropped off miles back, and I was relying on a crude offline map I had saved. The trees pressed in close, thick pines and bare-limbed oaks that blocked most of the sky. Eventually, the road dead-ended in a small clearing, and there it was, the cabin. A squat, weathered structure with a slanted tin roof, a front porch missing a few planks, and one window boarded up. It looked rough, but it would do. I killed the engine, grabbed my bag, and let my dog out. He was a big German shepherd, always alert, ears perked as he sniffed the air. The place smelled like damp wood, old leaves, and something else, something faintly sour that I couldn't place. I shook it off, chalking it up to mildew or something rotting in the underbrush. Inside, the cabin was as basic as I expected. A small cot in the corner, a cast-iron stove, a shelf with some rusted-out canned goods, and a wooden table that wobbled when I touched it. Dust coated everything. It was obvious no one had been here for a long time. I cracked open the windows, let some fresh air in, and started unpacking. My dog stuck close, pacing the room, sniffing at the walls, then finally settling near the door. His hackles weren't raised, but he was uneasy. Maybe he smelled a raccoon or something that had been inside before we got there. I spent the rest of the day exploring around the cabin, finding a small creek about a 5-minute walk away and marking my surroundings. I wanted to make sure I had my bearings if I needed to get out in a hurry. The forest was dense, and it got dark fast under the thick canopy. I made sure to gather some firewood before heading back. By nightfall, I had a fire going in the old stone pit outside. I cooked a simple meal, fed my dog, and sat listening to the night sounds. Crickets, distant owls, the occasional rustling in the brush. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then I heard something that was out of place. A steady, rhythmic thudding, faint but distinct. It wasn't an animal sound. It was deliberate, like something heavy being dragged or dropped repeatedly. I turned my head, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it echoed strangely through the trees. My dog lifted his head, ears pricked forward. He was listening too. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I waited, staring out into the trees, but nothing moved. The fire crackled. My dog lay his head back down, and I tried to push the unease aside. The woods were full of weird noises. Trees groaned, branches fell. Could have been anything. Still, I kept my knife close when I finally turned in for the night. I didn't sleep well. The cot was stiff, and the wind rattled the loose window pane. At some point, I heard my dog growl low in his throat. Not loud, not aggressive, but enough to wake me up. I reached out in the dark, feeling his back rise and fall under my palm. He wasn't standing, just lying there, but tense. I listened. First, there was nothing. Then, faintly, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. Not animal footsteps, these were too heavy, too precise. My breath went shallow. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and pointed it at the window. Nothing. I sat up, every muscle on edge. My dog stayed still but watchful. The footsteps stopped. I waited, listening, my heart hammering. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, exhaustion won. I laid back down, keeping the flashlight in my hand until sleep finally took me. Morning came, and with it, a creeping sense of unease. I stepped outside, looking for any signs that someone had been near the cabin. The dirt around the porch was undisturbed. No boot prints, no dragged branches, nothing to explain the sounds from the night before. I told myself I had imagined it. Maybe a deer, maybe just the house settling, maybe my own paranoia. But my dog was acting strange, sticking close to me, watching the woods like he expected something to come out at any moment. I decided to stay busy. I spent the day gathering more wood, fishing at the creek, trying to enjoy the solitude. By the time evening rolled around, I had almost convinced myself that everything was fine. But as soon as the sun dipped below the trees, that feeling came creeping back. The sense that I wasn't alone. I built the fire bigger that night. My dog refused to leave my side, his ears constantly twitching. I kept my knife close, my flashlight in my lap. Hours passed, and nothing happened. No footsteps, no sounds. I started to think maybe whatever it was had moved on. Then, just as I was about to turn in, something changed. The woods, which had been alive with the sounds of insects and night birds, went silent. Completely, unervingly silent. A deep, dragging sound came from the trees. Slow, deliberate. My dog stood, his body rigid, a low growl in his throat. I gripped my knife, my pulse pounding. The fire crackled, casting flickering light beyond the clearing, but I couldn't see anything. The sound continued, moving closer, then stopped. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Someone or something was just beyond the firelight, watching, waiting. I didn't move. My dog didn't move. We just stood there, locked in a silent standoff with whatever was in those trees. Then, after what felt like forever, the night sounds slowly returned. Whatever had been there was gone. I didn't sleep that night. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed my things. I didn't care what it was. I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I loaded up my truck, my dog jumping in without hesitation, and I left that place behind. I never told my friend what happened. Never asked if anyone else had experienced something similar at that cabin. I didn't want to know. All I knew was that something had been out there in those woods, watching, waiting, and I wasn't about to go back to find out why. I took the cabin rental because I needed the space to think. A week off work, a place with no cell service, no responsibilities, and no one around. The idea of being alone, completely alone, felt like the kind of quiet I needed. I had driven 6 hours from the city, deep into the mountains, far beyond where most people went. The roads narrowed, turning from pavement to gravel, then from gravel to dirt. The last stretch had been rough, full of ruts and washouts that scraped the undercarriage of my truck. By the time I reached the cabin, my hands were stiff from gripping the wheels so tight. The place was as simple as the pictures had shown. One story, dark wood, sitting at the base of a densely forested ridge. The trees climbed sharply behind it, thick with pine and scrub, the kind of terrain that swallowed sound. The front had a wraparound porch, weathered but sturdy. A single set of wooden stairs led up to the door, which was painted a dull green, chipped at the edges. A rusted tin roof stretched over the place, sloping just enough that snow wouldn't stick in the winter. The inside was just as bare. A single open room with a small wood-burning stove, a few cabinets, and a sink on one side. The bedroom was just a mattress on a wooden frame, covered in a heavy quilt that smelled of cedar. No TV, no radio. The electricity came from a generator in the back, but I had planned on using it only when I really needed to. The bathroom was an outhouse a short walk behind the cabin, just inside the tree line. I settled in quickly, unpacked my food, stacked the firewood on the porch, and made sure the doors and windows shut properly. The air was crisp, cooler than I expected for this time of year. The quiet settled in thick. I hadn't realized how much constant noise I had been used to. Traffic, voices, phones, the hum of appliances. Out here, the only sound was the wind shifting through the trees, the occasional creak of the old cabin settling. The first night passed without trouble. I kept a lantern burning low, read a paperback until my eyes felt heavy, then turned in early. I woke once, deep in the night, not sure why. The darkness felt heavier than before, the silence pressing in. I lay still, listening. Something had woken me, a noise, but I couldn't place it. The second day, I explored the ridge behind the cabin. The slope was steeper than I had expected, covered in loose rock and dry pine needles that made footing tricky. I climbed until I found a clearing, the kind made by old landslides. A few fallen trees, a mess of splintered wood, and an open view of the valley below. The cabin looked small from up here, almost swallowed by the tree line. I stayed up there longer than I meant to. The sun started dipping behind the ridge, and the temperature dropped fast. I turned back, hurrying down the slope, slipping more than once on the loose ground. By the time I reached the cabin, the light was nearly gone. I made a fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat on the porch, watching the last bit of daylight disappear. That night, I woke again. This time, I knew what had startled me. A sound outside. Not the wind, not the usual creaks of the cabin. Something moving. I sat up slowly, straining to hear. There it was again, a soft crunching. Footsteps, just beyond the porch. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand and clicked it on, aiming the beam toward the window. The glass reflected most of it back at me, but through the glare, I saw movement. A shape just outside. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. The shape moved again, slow, deliberate. Not an animal. Too steady, too careful. Then silence. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. My hands felt cold, fingers stiff from gripping the flashlight. I didn't hear anything else. Finally, I let out a slow breath and climbed out of bed. I kept the flashlight on, moved to the window and looked out. Nothing. I stood there for a long time, watching. The darkness outside seemed thicker than before, the trees pressing in close. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, that something had been watching. I barely slept the rest of the night. Every sound made my skin crawl. Every shift in the wind sent a spike of adrenaline through me. I kept expecting to hear those footsteps again. By morning, the feeling hadn't faded. I stepped outside carefully, scanning the ground. The dirt around the cabin was mostly dry and packed hard. But just beyond the porch, in a patch of looser soil, I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. Bare. Human. They led from the tree line, stopped just at the bottom step of the porch, then turned back. I felt my stomach twist. The nearest town was miles away. I hadn't seen another person since I left the highway. There was no reason for someone to be out here. No reason for them to come so close, then leave without a word. I spent the day on edge, checking the tree line, trying to convince myself that it was just a hiker passing through. Someone lost, maybe. Someone who didn't mean anything by it. But the feeling didn't go away. That night, I barricaded the door with the heavy wooden chair from the kitchen. I shut and locked every window. I lay in bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Sometime after midnight, the noise came again. This time it was closer. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight. The footsteps moved toward the porch. Slow, measured, then a creak. The bottom step, the next step. I sat up, my heart hammering. The cabin door was old, the lock simple. If someone really wanted in, another step. I gripped the flashlight, my pulse thudding in my ears. Then silence. Minutes passed. An hour. I didn't move. I waited for the next step, for a hand on the door, for the sound of the handle turning. But nothing came. When the sun rose, I finally got the nerve to open the door. The footprints were there, clearer this time, leading up the stairs, stopping just at the door. I didn't pack. I didn't eat. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and I left. The drive back felt longer, the road rougher. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. When I finally had cell service again, I pulled over and checked the listing for the cabin. It was gone. No record of it. No rental history. Nothing. Like it had never existed. The drive to the cabin took longer than expected. I had planned to reach it before dark, but the winding forest roads, the occasional downed branch, and the thickening mist had slowed me down. By the time I pulled up to the small clearing where the cabin stood, the last light of the day was fading behind the dense treeline. The place was old but sturdy, a single-story wooden structure with a sagging roof, darkened by years of rain and snow. The porch creaked under my boots as I climbed the few steps up to the door. I pushed it open and was met with the musty scent of wood, dust, and something else. Something faint, like old sweat or damp earth. I dropped my bag inside and locked the door behind me. The inside was bare, just a few pieces of heavy furniture, a small wood stove in the corner, and a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was no electricity, just a set of old oil lamps and a fireplace that I'd have to get going before the cold set in. I checked my phone. No service. I wasn't surprised. The nearest town was almost an hour away, and the last time I had checked the maps, there were no towers anywhere close. I had brought a battery-powered radio for emergencies, but I hadn't tested it yet. I figured I'd get to that later. The first thing I needed was firewood. I had noticed a small pile outside when I pulled up, but it was damp from the afternoon drizzle. I grabbed my hatchet and headed towards the treeline. The forest was silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I found a few dry logs near a fallen tree, split them quickly, and carried them back inside. Once the fire was going, the cabin felt a little less lifeless. I made a quick meal from the supplies I had packed. A can of beans heated over the fire, some crackers, and a bottle of water. The silence pressed in on me as I ate. No cars, no voices, just the occasional pop from the burning wood and the wind pushing against the trees outside. I had chosen this place for the isolation. I needed to clear my head, to get away from everything for a while. But as the darkness settled in completely, the isolation felt different. Less like a break and more like something pressing down on me. I decided to turn in early. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the old cot in the corner, checked the lock on the door one last time, and lay down, listening to the fire crackle as I drifted off. I don't know what woke me up. Maybe the cold. The fire had burned down to just glowing embers, and the air was colder than it should have been. I sat up, rubbing my arms, and then I heard it. A noise outside. Not the wind, not an animal. Something deliberate. A slow, heavy movement just beyond the cabin walls. I held my breath and listened, stopped for a moment, then resumed. Footsteps. Not the light, quick steps of a deer or the skittering of a raccoon. These were heavier, slower, pressing into the damp earth with weight behind them. I stayed completely still. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? Maybe. But something about the sound wasn't right. It wasn't the shuffle of a four-legged animal moving through the brush. It was measured, careful. I reached for my flashlight, but the moment I clicked it on, the sound stopped. I didn't move. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the rough wooden floor, the door, the single window covered with an old curtain. Silence. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, my ears straining for any hint of movement. But there was nothing, just the wind. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been an animal. Maybe something large, maybe a moose or a bear passing through. I turned off the flashlight and lay back down, but it took a long time for sleep to come. The next morning, I stepped outside and checked the ground around the cabin. The soil was damp from the night air, but I saw nothing unusual. No tracks, no disturbances. I told myself I had imagined it, that I was just jumpy from being alone out here. I pushed the thought aside and went about my day, splitting more firewood, hiking a short trail nearby, making another simple meal over the fire. By the time night fell again, I was exhausted. The fear from the night before had dulled, replaced by the ache in my muscles and the kind of tiredness that makes you feel like you could sleep through anything. I was wrong. I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the cabin wall. It wasn't loud. A slow, deliberate dragging sound just beneath the window. I sat up, heart hammering. My first thought was an animal rubbing against the cabin, but something about it felt wrong. Too precise, too slow. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, but as soon as the light hit the window, the sound stopped. I waited. Nothing. I stood up slowly, keeping the flashlight pointed toward the window. My mind raced. Do I go outside? Stay put? Then, just as I took a step toward the door, something knocked. A single, heavy knock. I froze. Then another, and another. Not frantic, not hurried, just 3 slow, heavy knocks. I swallowed hard. My hand tightened around the flashlight. I forced myself to move closer to the door. The cabin had no peephole, no way to see outside without opening it. I hesitated, then reached for my hunting knife, gripping the handle tight. Another knock, just one this time. I took a deep breath, reached for the lock, and silence. I stood there waiting. My breath came fast and shallow. My hand stayed on the lock, but I didn't turn it. Minutes passed. Then finally, footsteps. Slow, steady, moving away from the cabin, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going, the knife beside me, my back against the wall where I could see both the door and the window. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the first light touched the trees, I packed my bag. I didn't bother with breakfast. I threw everything into my truck, started the engine, and didn't look back. I don't know who or what was out there, but I do know one thing. I wasn't alone. I had rented the cabin for a week. Just me, the quiet, and the deep woods. It was a simple place, a single-room structure with an old iron stove, a twin bed against the far wall, and a tiny bathroom with a door that barely closed all the way. The floorboards creaked, the window frames were swollen from the damp, and the place smelled of pine and old smoke. But it was cheap and it was remote. That's what I wanted. The first couple of nights were uneventful. I spent my days hiking the narrow trails that wove through the forest, my evenings cooking simple meals on the stove, and my nights listening to the wind move through the trees. There were no nearby cabins, no roads within miles, and no cell service. That had been the appeal, complete solitude. On the third night, I woke up suddenly. No noise had woken me, at least none I remembered, but my skin was buzzing, my heart thudding like I had just been startled. The cabin was pitch black, and for a few moments, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what had pulled me from sleep. Then I heard it, a soft, steady noise, a faint tap, tap, tap. I held my breath, listening. The sound wasn't inside. It was coming from outside the cabin, rhythmic and deliberate. At first, I thought it might be a branch against the window, but the noise wasn't coming from that direction. It was coming from the front door. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My mind ran through the possibilities, an animal, the wind shifting something, maybe even a loose shutter. But the taps continued, slow and even not random like an animal might make. I sat up as quietly as I could and reached for the flashlight on the floor next to my bed. When I clicked it on, the soft yellow beam illuminated the rough wooden walls, the empty chair near the stove, the closed front door. The tapping had stopped. For a long time, I sat there, listening to the silence, the blood pounding in my ears. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I lay back down, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. It took me hours to fall asleep again. The next morning, I walked outside to check the area around the door. The ground was soft from the recent rain, and I could see my own footprints from when I had arrived. But there were other marks too. Not footprints exactly, but something had disturbed the earth in front of the door. Small indentations, like something had been tapping lightly against the dirt. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a raccoon or a porcupine. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled deep in my gut. That evening, I made sure to lock the door and wedge a chair under the handle, just in case. I kept the flashlight within arm's reach, but I told myself it was paranoia. I tried to push it from my mind. Just after midnight, I woke up again. This time, the sound was different. It wasn't the tapping. It was the sound of something moving outside. A faint rustling, then silence, then the creak of a branch shifting under weight. I stayed perfectly still, listening. It was close, whatever it was. Maybe just outside the window. The cabin had a single window, small and high on the wall, with an old warped pane of glass. There were no curtains, nothing to block the view if I stood up and looked out. I couldn't bring myself to do it. The sound moved again. This time, I was certain it was right outside. A shuffling noise, slow and careful, like something testing the ground before stepping. I felt a cold sweat break out on my back. The flashlight was in my hand, but I didn't turn it on. I just lay there, staring at the dark ceiling, willing myself not to move, not to breathe too loud. I don't know how long it lasted. Felt like hours. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. Silence pressed against the walls of the cabin, and I stayed awake until dawn. By the time daylight filled the woods, I had convinced myself I was overreacting. Sleep deprivation, the isolation, the natural sounds of the forest, all of it was playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I spent the day walking, forcing myself to enjoy the crisp air and the scent of pine, trying to ignore the anxiety twisting in my gut. But as I circled back toward the cabin, I noticed something I had missed before. The side of the cabin, just beneath the window, had long, faint scratches running across the wood. Not deep, not obvious at first glance, but definitely there. That night, I locked the door again, pushed the chair against it, and sat awake for hours with the flashlight in my hand. I told myself I would leave in the morning, just pack up and go. It wasn't worth another night of this, but something had other plans. Sometime past midnight, the sound started again. Not the tapping, not the rustling. This time, it was the unmistakable creak of wood under weight. A slow, deliberate pressure against the front porch. A pause, then another creak. I sat up, my pulse hammering in my throat. My flashlight was off, but I could just barely make out the dim outline of the door in the darkness. The noise came again. This time, the sound of something pressing against the wood, testing it. I gripped the flashlight but didn't turn it on. I didn't want to see. The pressure against the door grew. It wasn't forceful, not an attempt to break in. Just steady, like something was leaning its weight against the wood. Then, slowly, the door handle rattled. Once, twice. My stomach twisted. I stayed frozen in place, every muscle locked. The handle rattled again. Harder this time, like someone was checking if it was locked. Then silence. Minutes passed. I don't know how long. Maybe an hour. And then, finally, the weight against the door shifted. The slow creaks of the porch boards. The faint sound of something moving away into the trees. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my bag and left. I didn't even bother making breakfast. I didn't stop to check the door or the porch or look for tracks. I just grabbed my things, threw them in the car, and started driving. I didn't look back. It was only hours later, when I finally stopped for gas, that I noticed something. My hands were still shaking, and when I reached for my wallet, something cold trickled down my spine. There, on my sleeve, were 3 thin scratches, just like the ones on the side of the cabin. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know, but I'll never go back to that place again. I don't know why I thought staying in that cabin alone was a good idea. It wasn't my first solo trip, not by a long shot, but something about this one felt off before I even got there. Maybe it was the way the rental agent hesitated before handing over the keys, or the way she asked, twice, if I was sure I'd be staying alone. Maybe it was the drive up, the winding mountain road slick from recent rain, the thick trees crowding the narrow lane, branches arching over like they were trying to close me in. The cabin sat at the end of a long, rutted dirt driveway, barely wide enough for my truck. It looked older than I expected, not run down exactly, but worn in a way that made me uneasy. The logs were dark with age, the roof sagged just slightly in the middle, and the front porch was cluttered with leaves that looked like they had been there for months. There was a woodshed off to the side, stacked high with logs, and beyond that, the forest pressed in thick and uninviting. The moment I stepped inside, the air felt stale, like no one had been there in a long time. It smelled like damp wood and old dust, and the floorboards creaked under my boots. There was a main room with a wood stove and an old couch, a tiny kitchen with a gas stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years, and a bedroom with a heavy wooden bed frame that took up most of the space. A single window faced the back of the property, looking out over nothing but trees. I set my gear down and went back out to unload the rest of my supplies. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I told myself it was just the isolation. I had stayed in remote places before, but this one felt different, heavier, like the forest was pressing down on me. I forced myself to shake it off, stacking firewood near the porch and checking to make sure the door locks worked properly. They did, but they felt flimsy. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped, and I got a fire going in the stove. The light flickered against the walls, casting shifting shadows, making the room feel smaller. I ate a quick meal, read for a while, then decided to turn in early. As I lay in bed, I could hear the forest outside, the occasional rustling of branches, the distant call of an owl. Normal sounds, but in that cabin alone they felt unnatural. At some point, I must have dozed off, but something woke me. A noise outside, a soft, deliberate crunch of leaves. My body went rigid, my breath caught in my throat. I waited, straining to hear, but everything was silent. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon sniffing around, but the feeling in my gut said otherwise. I reached for my flashlight and eased out of bed. The floor was cold against my feet as I crept to the window. The glass was old, slightly warped, making the view outside distorted. I couldn't see anything, just darkness and the vague outline of trees swaying in the wind. I waited, listening, my heart pounding. Then I heard it again, closer this time. I stepped back from the window, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. I grabbed my hunting knife from my bag, feeling the weight of it in my hand, comforting but not enough to ease the tension coiling in my chest. I moved to the front door and checked the lock again, making sure it was secure. The air felt thick, the silence pressing in. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes. I don't know. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into a restless sleep, waking up at every imagined sound. When morning finally came, I felt drained, my body heavy, my head foggy. I stepped outside, the cold air shocking me awake. The forest was still, the ground wet from dew. I walked around the cabin, checking for signs of anything unusual. First, I saw nothing. Then, near the tree line, I found them. Footprints, not boot prints. Bare feet, pressed deep into the damp earth. Large, too large to be anything normal. They led from the trees to the edge of the clearing, stopping just before the cabin. A sick feeling coiled in my stomach. Someone had been out here last night, standing just yards from where I slept, watching. I looked around, scanning the trees, but there was nothing, just silence. I followed the tracks a few feet, but they disappeared into the undergrowth, swallowed by the forest. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat by the fire, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I told myself it could have been anything, but I didn't believe it. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside had me gripping my knife, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I kept the fire burning low, the flickering light the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. The next morning, I packed up and left. I didn't care that I had paid for the whole week. As I drove away, the cabin shrinking in my rearview mirror, I felt a weight lift off my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if anything was standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave.